Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is part of the Star Business Solutions webinar series. Today's topic being Greentree Back to Basics. We're going to have myself, Norman Hall, and Josh Diffie presenting today. For those who don't know me, I'm the Director of Marketing for Star. I'm also Trisha's husband and a co-owner of Star. Josh is our pre-sales engineer, demo guy, or man who knows everything that's worth knowing. Today's agenda will basically be a demonstration where Josh will go through a number of various items, including workflow desktops, approvals and alerts, business process manager. Then I'll move on to some Greentree tips and tricks. When we get to the question and answer period, please come up with lots of questions about things that you'd like to know about. We might as well pick Josh's brain while we've got him here. So he's got everything set up and we'll be able to hopefully demonstrate ways and means of doing things for you. Okay, our Back to Basics demonstration, I'll hand over to Josh.
Thanks, Norman. Okay, so we'll jump on into Greentree. So what we'll be doing today is going through, as Norman said, a number of items, being workflow desktops, approvals and alerts, business process manager, and some tips and tricks on some of the things that that potential users may have seen in training many moons ago, or potentially those that were trained by staff rather than Star potentially have overlooked or missed certain areas. So we'll start by jumping into some workflow desks. So the workflow desktop concept has been around in Greentree for quite a number of years, but over the years, additional features have been added to the module, and in some instances, users have not seen those features or potentially just not implemented those additional features. So I'm going to jump into a more traditional desktop, so one that I think a lot of organizations who are using workflow desktops probably are using to at least this level. And for that, I'm going to use sales orders. I understand that not every organization that's on today's webinar will have sales orders, but conceptually, I'm hoping that I can cover a couple of different examples to cover as many organizations as possible. So a workflow desktop can pretty much show any record within Greentree. Here I'm looking at up the top, sales orders that are on back order. Up the top right-hand corner, sales orders waiting to be picked. The bottom center, the ones that are currently being picked. And on the right-hand side, the ones that have been picked and ready to be invoiced. Now these desktops are live, so as something new happens, they're going to populate into my desk, and as soon as they're no longer relevant or part of my desktop, they'll either move around or disappear. And this is standard functionality that's been in the Workflow Desktop Designer pretty much since day one. And what I mean by those being live and moving around, if I was to look at one of these sales orders that are currently in progress, if I was to mark this as finalized, you'll notice that it automatically moved to my ready to invoice. Now, that would also populate any other user's workflow desk that has that record now required to be displayed. As I said, that's pretty much standard functionality, and I would imagine that a lot of users of Greentree that are currently using the workflow desktops would already be using that feature. However, some of the additional features that we'd like to show really came out a number of years back, and it's what we often refer to as 3D Live tiles. So if I was to continue on the sales order example, and go to a slightly different desk. So this desktop is showing pretty much the same 4 tiles that we were just looking at, but now you'll see some grey tiles around the edges. These are those 3D live tiles I was just talking about. And I've got it set up for this desktop to display information that relates to the role or function I'm currently doing. And that's really the key with workflow desktops as far as we're concerned, is to design them around a person's role or function to make their life easier. So this desktop is a sales order entry desktop. So to do that, I'm just going to bring up a sales order entry screen. I'm just going to make it slightly smaller just to make sure I can see all those grey boxes. So as I progress through a sales order, so I'm, for example, selecting a customer, you'll notice it's now populating my desktop with information that relates to that. So the bottom right-hand corner, I'm showing their recent sales. The bottom left-hand corner, I'm seeing their open quotes. You can show any piece of information that relates to the record I've just selected. As I progress through, if I was to select, for example, an inventory item, those tiles are updating again. So the top right-hand corner, I'm seeing a picture of the inventory item. Next to that, I'm seeing its availability and what's on purchase order. And then I'm also seeing what those purchase orders are, when they are, how many. And down the bottom, I'm seeing my commitments. For that inventory item, what other customers have currently got orders for it, what the order number is, and when they're due. So potentially, I could reallocate some of those stock depending on priorities. So the idea behind this is to pick as much information throughout the system that would be relevant to the role I'm currently performing. As I said, in this example, a sales order entry screen. If I was to jump to just to one more example, so I'm not dominating the webinar with sales order focused examples, here I've got to look at a debt collection style desktop. So I'm showing a list of AR invoices, and you'll notice here that I've got some highlighting rules. So our workflow desktops now have the ability, or have had the ability for some time, to have as many different highlighting rules as you feel appropriate. So I've kept it quite simple based on my current posting periods. I'm saying if it's over 90 days old, show it in orange. If it's on hold, show it in grey. But you could have broken that down further. You know, over 30 days, show it in orange. Over 60 days, show it in red. Completely up to you. Once again, I've got those 3D live tiles around the edge, showing in grey. So as I make a selection, so for example, I select that invoice for Kangan, I've got that populating with the detail I asked it to. So up the top right-hand corner, I'm showing current balances, other outstanding invoices, what current sales orders they've got in the system that we haven't yet delivered, what my recent note, debt collection note history is, and that's using sticky notes, which I'll come to again a little further on, and their contact details. So picking the information that relates throughout the system that's going to help me with this role. So obviously if I'm talking to the customer and saying, hey, I want you to pay your bill, being able to use some of that other information to leverage that conversation. So being able to say, if you don't pay your bill, we're not going to deliver these goods, or whatever else it might be. Or in this instance, down the bottom, I can see other times I've had to speak to them, what invoice is that related to. And you'll notice that this one highlighted in red, once again, those highlighting rules, that's an outstanding invoice. So what that means in my example is those first two ones without a highlighting rule, yes, we had to speak to them twice about that invoice, but they've since paid it. And the top one in red, we've spoken to them once, but they're yet to pay it. So picking and choosing all the information that you're interested in. All right, I'm just seeing there's a couple of questions here. Just got a question coming through saying how to get this screen. I might come back to the questions at the end of the session. At first, I thought that might have been people couldn't see the screen. I'm assuming that's referring to how do I get access to these workflow desktops. All the workflow desktops that I am going through today are in my demonstration system, and what we'll look at doing is exporting them out of the the demonstration system and available to the consultants. So get in contact with your primary consultant about any of the potential desktops or other records we go through today you might be interested in. Okay, so that's the, workflow desktops, and the key thing that I wanted to cover off as part of this session was really around the 3D Live tiles. So making them proactive and showing you information that you need to know as part of those roles or functions, as well as some of those highlighting rules that can potentially jump out at you and assist with highlighting issues, potentially before they become issues, where possible. The next thing I wanted to talk about was approvals and alerts. So the approvals and alerts module within Greentree, once again, has been around for quite some time, and a lot of users or a lot of our clients have purchased it for the purpose of approval processes. And so, as I can see at my top right-hand corner on this desktop, I'm showing outstanding approvals for both purchase orders, supplier invoices, and a couple of other records. And that's a fairly common practice. So I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on the approvals side of the approvals and alerts module. I'm going to more focus on the alerts side of that module name. And that's one of the things that quite often gets a little overlooked in the discussion points around this module. So the first one I thought I'd touch on is continuing on along the workflow desk scenario. So I've got a purchasing desktop where I'm showing some information, so some outstanding purchase orders, some back orders, and you'll see there's a low inventory tile which is currently empty up the top right hand corner. So you can use the approvals and alerts module to populate tiles with what's commonly referred to as alert collections, and that's what I've got set up in this top right hand corner. Now normally you would have these rules scheduled to run. However, if I have them scheduled to run in this session, I'd have to time it absolutely perfectly for the rule to fire as I'm talking. So for this one, I'm going to manually hit the go button. So basically what this rule is doing is you can schedule it. So I've got it scheduled to run daily, but as I said, I'll be running it now in just a moment. And I've got it going to look at the quantity available. Is it within 20% of its minimum reorder level for a specific location? If it is, populate my workflow desk. So this is something you would set up, schedule to run, and pretty much whenever it's appropriate, it will populate that desk. So if I hit run now, that's gone through all my inventory items that met that criteria and showing them on a workflow desk. Now the slight difference between an alert collection and a regular tile on a workflow desk is not only can you populate it with things like approvals and alerts, but you can also remove its items from these desktops just by clicking on them and going remove from list. So if for whatever reason you're not interested in this one right now, I can just hit remove, potentially remove all if that's appropriate, or drill into it to do whatever it is that I'm interested in doing. So if I double click on that one and I decide I wish to create a purchase order, it's a nice quick process to get where I need to go. And those alert collections can be anything within Greentree. Literally any record in Greentree you can show on a workflow desktop using alert collections. If I was to have a little bit of a more HR focus, this is a desktop showing me my soon to expire certificates. Similar scenario with those highlighting rules we were just talking about. I've got it that if they're soon to expire within 30 days, show in orange, and if they're expired, show in red. Now, that's a workflow desk, and that's going to be really handy, of course, for actual Greentree users. But in this example, this is something that I would normally expect I'd want to notify the employee themselves. So I've gone and set up a HR certificate reminder rule, and that I've got set to run weekly. Once again, I'm going to hit the run now button in a moment, but this is something that you would set, and it would periodically run and send out a notification. Now, in a real world example, under the actions, we would send an email, not a workflow notification, but for today's demonstration, it's a lot easier to obviously display this to the webinar attendees. So when I hit run now, that's gone and populated my workflow tile down the bottom right-hand corner, being notifications. And you'll see that there are two showing up, being April and Cameron, saying that their accounting certificate or driver's license certificate is due to expire and on what date. So in this example, it's those two orange ones that I'm seeing in that center tile. Now you could have multiple approval alerts rules around this. So the first rule could have just sent an email to the employee themselves. You could have another rule that once you get within a certain time frame, maybe a week, it sends it to the employee again with their manager CC'd. So it's about scaling or having as many rules that are appropriate to potentially escalate these reminders as necessary. Alrighty. So that's using the alerts component for approvals and alerts. So that can be emails out to employees, salespeople. It can populate workflow desktops. It can create pop-up messages if that's appropriate. So if there is something that you want to notify people about throughout a process, remember that the approvals and alerts module does more than just approvals. BPM, or Business Process Manager, is a module that allows you to flowchart your processes within the system and then potentially force users down that path. So one of the things that we see especially in organizations that have been using the system for quite some time, they tend to have some fairly bedded down processes. And as new staff come on board and get trained on Greentree, you have to take them through those processes, of course. This Business Process Manager, or BPM tool, can help push those users down and speed up that training process. So an example of that, if I was to jump into my Process Flow Designer, it is a flow charting tool which you can drag and drop various items from the left-hand side. So things like asking questions, opening up screens and pre-populating information, opening up Word documents or spreadsheets, sending out emails. There's quite a lot of ability or functionality within this module. Now, each one of these tasks, so for example, this waiting for application, you can assign to a different user or team. And you can also, if you wish, do due dates and escalations as well. So for example, this one is the setup of a new customer. So potentially for that waiting for application task, maybe a week afterwards, we want to send out a reminder email to the customer, or we want to send a notification to the salesperson to chase it up. That's where those due dates and escalations can come into play. So how does it actually work for the end user? So generally speaking, they would have an icon somewhere on their desktop. In this example, I've got one smack bang in the middle here called Start a Process. If I click on that, I can select from the list of processes I have access to. So we're going to go with that new customer. That's then going to pop up the screens in the order in which I've asked it to. And if I come in here and just put in the bare bones to get through, so I'm just going to put in a new customer and hit save. So that's automatically marked them as inactive. It's going to open up my Word document and pre-fill the information I've told it to using mail merge-like functions. And I've now got on my workflow desk a task waiting for the application. Now this task, I can right click, assuming I have the access to do so, and hit view process. And it's kind of a follow the yellow brick road concept. So anything that's yellow has been completed. The green items are where we're currently up to in the list, and the items without a color yet are where we haven't got to those points or those tasks. Any one of these items, I can click on it. I've got the option of coming in and seeing who started it. In this case, it was the super user who I'm logged in as, who completed it, as well as timestamping it. So each one of these items, it'll tell me who did it and when they did it. There is also an audit trail, which is something that you wouldn't generally come into on a regular basis, but if you found that these processes were starting to take a bit longer than you expect, if this process was taking a week to complete because of that, maybe waiting for application, and then suddenly it started to blow out a little bit, you could start coming in and looking at the timestamps to work out where is that big gap that we're waiting for things to come in or users to complete their task. Any record that has been created from a business process, if I was to go to that record, this linked objects icon, which I'll be coming to in a lot more detail when we get to tips and tricks, but if I click on that linked objects icon, it'll show me the BPM process that it was created by, and I can double click on it, and it's going to show me the exact same screen I was just on, but this time I can get to it from the customer. So if you do have a situation, maybe further on down the track, if there was a credit check application that someone reviewed and approved, you might wish to look at the process this went through, who did that approval, when they did it, and potentially chase up the why or what's caused the issue. Alrighty, so that is BPM in a bit of a nutshell. We've got clients using it for all kinds of different processes, from the setup of customers to the setup of new inventory items to the setup of employees to the termination of employees. The more modules you have within Greentree and the more information you put in, the more relevant some of these tools become. And what I mean by that is we've got some of our clients that when they set up a new employee, they're also set up as one of our CRM contacts. And all the assets, so computers, phones, etc., are set up potentially as CRM assets. So what that allows us to do, both in the process to set up the new employee, we can create the assets, but also when terminating the employee, we know which ones to attempt to retrieve. But yes, these processes can be for any module or any modules within Greentree. So that's the Business Process Manager. So we've covered the workflow desktops, approvals and alerts, and BPM, which is commonly referred to as our workflow suite. And it really sits across every single module within Greentree. So it's one of the key areas that I try and cover fairly early in some of our look and feel demonstrations of how the system, how users get around. Some of the other tips and tricks I thought I'd jump into. One of them is what we call linked objects. So within Greentree, all the records that should already know about themselves do. And what I mean by that, if I was to bring up a supplier invoice, it knows about the supplier, of course, and I can just double click on that supplier and drill down to that record. That's what I'd commonly refer to as a native or a natural link. You don't have to tell the system anything to do with that. It'll automatically know it. But let's say I've entered a supplier invoice. In this example, it's a freight bill. I've paid it, but someone says down the track, hold on, that was the wrong freight account. It should have been to a different branch. So you go in and you do a general ledger journal. That's a fairly common scenario in this example. So you're correcting the incorrect account selection, and I've put a little bit of a narration there as well. But what I can do is I can click that linked objects icon. I can go to the other record, in this case, the supplier invoice, click the same icon, put in the reason. Josh selected the wrong accounts. And then from either direction, you'll notice that icon has now changed. But from either direction, someone says, what was this journal? Oh, that narration doesn't tell me enough. Click on that icon. I can see it relates to that supplier invoice. The link was created by the super user on this date, and I can simply double click, and it's going to bring up that record. And I can go either direction. So if someone else notices that this was the wrong account, I can see that it is already linked to a GL journal. Those linked objects can be used throughout Greentree to link any number of records to any other number of records. But the GL journal entry is probably the most common scenario that we see where people are using that option. The other thing that sometimes gets a little bit overlooked over time is the concept within Greentree called clever tables, and they're everywhere. Okay, so I'm going to use the sales order entry screen again as another example, and let's just select customer. So the data entry tab or table within the sales order entry screen has a significantly large number of fields. And realistically, it's more than anyone's ever going to use. But different clients use different fields for different reasons. So what you've got the ability of doing with Clever Tables is right-clicking, hitting Edit Column, and going through and unticking the fields or columns that don't relate to you. You know, if I, as a user, I'm not allowed to give a discount, you'll notice there's 3 different discount fields, one for percentage, one for amount, and whether or not you're holding that discount percentage. And I can just untick those, potentially some of the others. Maybe I don't ever change the default tax code or tax amounts, so I can significantly reduce the information on my screen. I've got the ability of saving those settings, so going forward, next time I do data entry, that will come up with my defaults. And this goes above and beyond some of the user security that you can do on things like sales orders and so on, where you can turn fields off at a system level. But this goes that extra step, and each individual user can then go, well, you know, I never changed these fields, so why do I need to clutter up my data entry? Now, a lot of the data entry screens will have 2 methods of entering data, and most people get used to just using the one. Okay, so if I'm someone that's more comfortable using a table format for data entry, then I would use that. And a lot of people forget the fact that there is also a line item tab. And this is on not just sales orders, it's on AR invoices, it's on AP invoices, it's on purchase orders. Any data entry screen, you'll notice there is both a line item tab as well as one of these clever tables. So if you find that most of the time, all you do is select the inventory item, the quantity, and that's it, then what you can do is you can go right down and tick off everything else. So I don't need some of these additional information because they're all going to default for me. I never change the unit of measure, the price book, etc., and significantly reduce the amount of information I have on my screen. So when I now do my data entry, I simply select my inventory item, I say how many, I could have potentially even turned off the price and narration, and I enter away. So speeding up that data entry process. But then that once in a blue moon where I'm allowed to give a discount, I can still click on that item, go to my line item tab, and enter my discount. Okay, so just because you've turned the fields off in one of these clever tables doesn't mean that you can't still get to that information, especially in these data entry screens. When you look at clever tables from a non-data entry screen, more of an inquiry sort of process or screen, so if I was to come into maybe the customer maintenance and go look at all the outstanding or all the invoices, same deal, I can still do that edit column and turn fields off. I can even rename headings if that's appropriate. I can rearrange them. I can also export this to Excel if required. So that is one of the areas, the export capability. For when the Clever Tables first came out, you had the ability of sending the table contents to a clipboard, okay, which for most users is fine. But if I hit send table contents to clipboard and I open up Excel and paste, then what that's going to do is Excel thinks it knows best. Numbers we treat as numbers, dates as dates, but these reference fields, you'll notice that it's thought they were numbers. So if this had, for example, a leading 0, it's going to clear that off. However, if within Greentree, I right click and instead of doing the send table contents to clipboard, I go launch table contents in Excel. That's going to open up my Excel, and this time it's remembered all the different formats. So dates are still dates, but you'll notice this reference column is no longer being treated as a number, it's being treated as a text field because that's what it is within Greentree. The actual numbers, so things like the outstanding values and so on, they are treated as numbers. So it is respecting what you would hope it would respect. Alrighty. So that is linked objects and clever tables, which quite often get overlooked as time goes on, as potentially some pretty handy functions within Greentree. Excuse me. So what we thought we might do at this stage is hand it over to you all for some question and answer time. So bear with me 1 second while I pop up one of the question screens. So the first question that I sort of covered a little earlier from Natalie, so how do we get this screen? And I believe that was relating to the workflow desktops. So for those users that have workflow, then all the workflow desktops that we've gone through today, as long as you've got the modules that it relates to, as I said before, we'll have them available for all of our consultants. So you can simply get in contact and say, yes, we're interested in these desktops, and we can simply import those into your system. I've just got a question from Kieran, who's currently unable to export to Excel from AR or AP since their last upgrade. I'm unfamiliar with that issue, Kieran. So I'd put that through to your primary consultant and get them to investigate it if they haven't already begun that for you. Delina, yes, if there's somewhere that you can get more information on the BPM module. What we'll do from this, if you want to have a chat with your primary consultant, they can potentially provide you with some documentation on that module, or potentially if you want to have a bit more of a detailed discussion about what type of processes you might be interested in, by all means, as I said, get in contact with your primary consultant. Daniel, is it possible to default the picture used in bookmarks favorites for each form when a user adds it to their favorites, or do the images need to be added manually by the user? Yes, so those images that I had on my favorites and bookmarks in today's demonstration, they are ones that a user has to add. So if you add favorites or bookmarks, they will default to having no picture, but you can add them yourselves. One of the other things you do have the ability of doing, though, within favorites and bookmarks, if I do set up my favorites list as I've set up here, you can right click and hit organize. This is where you can go through and hit change picture and so on, but you can also export and import these. So while the favorites and bookmarks are user specific, if you decide here's a list of favorites that I'm happy with and we want to sort of populate those out to other users, you've got the ability of setting that up on one user, hitting export and importing it to wherever you need to. So one of the other questions was how do we set up highlights for AR invoices tile on the workflow desktop? For sure. So within the workflow desktop designer, if I was to use that debt collection style desk that I went to before, one of the additional options is this table layout when you are showing a tile in table format. When you click on that, you then have the ability of not only displaying which fields you're interested in, but then on the left-hand side, you'll notice there's some highlighting rules. So you can simply hit add rule. You then have the ability of selecting any database field on that invoice. So, for example, it's probably the payment date. And then you can start doing things like, is it before or after? And you can use a keyword called today, or potentially compare it with the current period, depending on what's appropriate. And you can add 30 days to that as well. So there's a lot of different options as far as how you do those queries. And on each one of these highlighting rules, you can define what the background color and text color is going to be. Let me just make sure I'm keeping up with these questions. We've got quite a few coming through, so I'll try to get to them all. So currently, so Gavin, the question you've had on the AR Invoice desktop tile of changing the from posting date to earlier, the way the posting dates on that tile work is the to date is the current accounts receivable period, and then the from date is 1 year prior to that. There is no option at this stage on changing the default dates or alternatively leaving them for all open. It is something that that I can potentially run up the flagpole and look at adding that as an option. So yes, so that at this stage, unfortunately, there is no change to the default. It uses the accounts receivable posting periods. All right. Will you also be conducting a webinar on CRM and mobility? That's from Michelle. So it's definitely something we can add to the list of webinars.
You've actually preempted me because my last sign off was going to be asking for suggestions for future webinars. We have got a list that we're going to do, but we're always looking for more ideas. So thanks for that suggestion. It's now on my list of things to look at.
Martin, do you have any demos for job management and job scheduling within Greentree? Yeah, so the workflow desktops can be used for any module within Greentree. So, for example, if I was looking at a job management desktop, here I've got to look at all my active jobs. I'm showing things like what's the budgeted cost, actual cost, some calculations. And on the right-hand side, I've got those 3D live tiles that we went through earlier. So as I select a job, I've got it showing me the job details, open purchase orders, sub-jobs, timesheets. But as a user, you can then start defining what it is that you're interested in looking at with these 3D live tiles. As far as the actual scheduling component, we do have planning boards. As far as covering that in potentially a bit more detail, we can definitely look at having job scheduling as its own webinar. We potentially would be using the service request concept or module to potentially looking at scheduling individual tasks. But yeah, we can definitely add that to the list. Kieran, do you have a reference of what database field relates to what actual field, as the names are a bit ambiguous and we struggle with jQueries because of this? Yeah, so basically there was a data dictionary available on Greentree's campus. Unfortunately, that campus is currently unavailable to clients. It's a little bit out of our control, but we'll run that up the flagpole to potentially see if we can look at getting access to that in other ways. And that will give you access to see per screen what classes and database fields relate to each field. Yes, Kieran, what I'll do is I'll get in contact with your primary consultant. We can potentially, or if you can get in contact with your primary consultant and ask about the data dictionary, then potentially we can look at getting you access to that. So one of the questions was, can we see AR, AP aging based on the transaction branch since we use quad accounting? So I'm just trying to clarify that So is that, was that relating to the workflow desktops, or was that relating to just the AR, AP aged reports? If you could just let me know that, I might come back to your question. Yes, it is related to the workflow desktop. Okay. So very good question. So if I come into my so my balances, what we then, it is a 3D live tile. So at this stage, that is looking at, if I look at our invoice, that is currently looking at the customer's current AR aging periods, and then the various dates. What we might then need to look at is having a chat with your primary consultant. So one of the things Greentree does have the ability of doing now is this concept we call dynamic properties. So you've got the ability of one of the consultants creating a very small custom script for you that we can create additional database fields or potentially calculations. So we could look at adding new fields to get that result for you. Okay, so Gavin, so do you have any BPM templates that we can build from, e.g. new employee setup and termination? So Gavin, we do have in our demonstration system a couple of examples. So the setup of a new employee is one of those, the setup of a new customer is another. But what I'd be recommending is, once again, having a chat with your primary consultant about getting either training on that module or a workshop to discuss what the best options for your system might be. The example that we have has a number of different modules, and depending on what modules you have, so whether or not you have timesheets, assets, etc., will kind of dictate which way you go with these processes. Is there active jobs viewable available in version 4.11? Yeah, definitely, Yash. So the active jobs is a tile available to you. So basically, it's the ability to show jobs, and that's in the Workflow Desktop Designer. And within that, you then have the ability of limiting that down by a number of factors. In my example, I've got it limited down by job status, but you can pick and choose what that's going to relate to. Alright, so from Mel, sometimes when exporting data from tables using the export to XML function, it exports only the table headings and not the actual data in the table. Do you know what causes this? I'm unaware of that as an issue. I've never had that happen to myself as a user. I know that a number of your screens have been customized, Mel, so potentially it might be worth looking at whether or not that has anything to do with it, or whether or not it is a standard Greentree issue. And if it is, or either way, if you want to talk to your primary consultant, we can get someone to look into that. So Sohan, another question, how can we get the icons for the options you had on the menu and favorite tiles? So those are Greentree, what we call Greentree product icons. So what I might do is just confirm where the best place to store those might be, but that's definitely something that we could look at, once again, making available to users, as it makes sense to use similar icons across the board. Yep, so what I'd suggest, Sohan, is have a chat with your primary consultant, but I'll, in the meantime, be looking at the best place to potentially store those, whether or not we simply have them available to the consultants on a request basis, and we can just send you them through either in a zip file or whatever else it might be, or whether or not we put them on some FTP or something. That's we'll work out the technical side on our end. But yes, if you want to get in contact with your primary consultant saying that you're interested in those, we can definitely look at getting those. Alrighty. Craig, so the question was, how do we activate the 3D tiles within a Workflow desktop? Yeah, for sure. So within the Workflow Desktop Designer, If I was to just very quickly bring up that debt collection desk, for example, and get rid of one of the tiles, I'll just make some room. It's just one of the tiles available in the toolbox near the bottom, called 3D Live. As you drag it onto your desktop, you'll be asked to pick what's referred to as the trigger class. So when I selected an AR invoice on my desktop, the AR invoice was that class, but it could have been customer, could have been sales order, depending on what's appropriate. But as I do that, you then get the option of saying, well, what type of tile do you wish it to be? So as we can see on the right-hand side, one of the tiles is showing job information here. So that's what we call an attribute. Where I'm showing open purchase orders and sub-jobs, it's where that'd be collection. And in the previous desktop where I was showing images, that would of course be the image type. Depending on what you select, different options then become available. So if I just went with attribute, I then have the ability of saying, well, what do I want it to look like? You'll notice the one on the right is in table format, so I can either select text box or table. You can add rows and columns, and it is a drag and drop. So I can come in and go, invoice number, find the field I'm interested in, and drag it into the appropriate box. So that is how we would set it up. But if you want some more training on that in a bit more detail, then of course, once again, get in contact with your primary consultant. Alrighty, so I think I've got through all the questions so far. The list was fairly long. If somehow I have skipped your question, please put your hand up and let me know. Or if you've got any further questions, give us a shout out and we will try and cover those as well.
Okay, that looks like it for now. First of all, I'd like to thank Josh for putting together today's presentation. If you haven't gathered, he's very knowledgeable on the subject of Greentree. We will be sending a copy of the recording of today's webinar to all attendees. Hopefully, it'll come out within the next 24 hours. Sooner if we can organise it. If you have any further questions, then obviously please feel free to email your primary consultants with those questions. If you have if you've got any good ideas for future webinars, then please feel free to either email your primary consultant and ask them to pass on the suggestions to myself, or if you want to bypass that, my direct email address is norman.hall@star.cd. Please feel free to send it to me and I will add it to my list of potential webinars. So once again, thank you very much and have a great day.